Hello, and welcome to The Distillery. I'm your host, Harry Lee Shanglun. Today we have special guest Samuel Moody joining us. How are you doing today, Sam?
Yeah, great. Harry, how you going?
I'm doing well, thank you. Whereabouts are you streaming in from?
From Alice Springs, from my house. Yeah, in the middle of Australia.
As the ads tell us, it's like dead center sort of thing. And what do you do in Alice Springs?
So I work for the North Australian Aboriginal Justice Agency, known as NAJA, it's the largest firm in the Northern Territory, largely because there's a lot of, there's none of the big corporate firms make it here, and there's a lot of criminal law, need for criminal lawyers here. So primarily I work with youth. So I'm a youth defence lawyer. So majority of my work is court-based and in the local court. I'm still pretty junior, so I don't have much to do with the Supreme Court and going higher. But yeah, that's a majority of my work is done in the local court, protecting youths, helping them present themselves to court, making plans about how they're going to deal with their court. And then there's also a bit of dabbling in the adult jurisdiction as well, because there's quite a bit of need across both jurisdictions.
I'm keen to ask you more about that kind of work that you're doing there. But before we dive into it, how did you actually get involved in this kind of work? What's your journey been towards it? How did you become interested?
Yeah, well, it was when I did this elective when I studied law at Monash, and it was Indigenous people in the law. And my lecturer, Stephen Gray, he actually worked for my organisation, but in Darwin. And he worked in Darwin for years and years, and progressed quite a lot of, moved the territory forward in a lot of ways where it was lacking behind the other states. And he had quite an interesting story just describing Indigenous injustice and everything that they were going through. So that prompted me to apply for an internship while I was still studying. So I went to NAJA in Darwin and saw just firsthand, firstly, how much injustice there is and how difficult it is for an Indigenous person going through this whole foreign legal jurisdiction and having all this stuff thrown at them without very much assistance, without much support. And you just look at the statistics and you see how difficult it is for an Indigenous person, just from the moment they're born, what the stats are all against them in terms of the likelihood of them being involved in any sort of court system and having to face the criminal charges at some point in their life. And you're like, something's wrong there. And there's a way that we can help there. And I was just really inspired by the advocacy when I was an intern that NAJA was doing. So then fast forward a couple of years and I graduated, worked for a year at a suburban firm in Melbourne, dabbled a little bit in criminal law, but mostly worked in victims of crime. And then I saw an opening in Alice Springs. I actually have a sister, Rachel, who lives here in Alice Springs, who's a nurse. So I had a reason to be interested in having a safe place to move up here. And I was like, oh, this is a great opportunity. Can't turn this down. Because it was combining a couple of my passions, because since I finished school, I was volunteering at my church's youth group, and I really, really enjoy working with youth and mentoring them. And just hearing it, I just find youth really interesting, really funny, and just so insightful in a lot of what they do. And combining that with helping people through the court system, which is something I've been trained in, it was like the perfect marriage. I was like, yes, this is, and I've found that in 1 year of being here.
And so, okay, you've touched on a couple of different points there in your origin story. One being that the NT as a territory lacks a lot of what other states have, is something you alluded to, and that there is gross injustice against Indigenous people and population. Can you expand on that? In what ways is the Northern Territory different to the other states? What's going on over there?
Yeah, well, obviously there's no explicit racism from the legislative government or anything. Nothing in the Crimes Act or anything would say this is explicitly targeting an Indigenous person. But you just look at sentencing comparisons, how sentencing here is much more, they're much more trigger happy with sending people to lock up for a long time. And by extension, that's affecting Indigenous people, considering over 85% of prison populations in Alice Springs and Darwin are Indigenous. So you can't say there's something explicit from the top in the way that legislation's written, but implicitly in the way that police and judges probably go about things. There's always, you can just see that there's an assumption that the redemption or the rehabilitation process with a white person is going to be quite different from an Indigenous person, because there's all these presumptions that come with an Indigenous person. It's not something that's like secret in the law. There's plenty of High Court cases that discuss it. Some of them have been quite groundbreaking in recent years. A notable one would be a case called Bugmy and the Queen, which I'm pretty sure came from Queensland actually, but it breached the High Court, so it applies everywhere. And just is discussing, or is Aboriginality inherently something that is going to be a disadvantage to an individual, and should that be applied in sentencing principles that, because you're an Indigenous person, we're going to reduce your sentence automatically because we presume that there's all this disadvantage in your background? Or is that bringing race into a sentencing consideration that shouldn't be there? Ultimately, they decided, well, the High Court's decision was that, well, no, it's not a race-based thing, that there is a fundamental assumption that if someone is Indigenous, that they would have faced all these challenges throughout their life. So that was great that they recognised that, but then applying it in practice is something different. So, for example, here, just even in the local court, I've had local court judges mention, Bugmy doesn't apply in the territory because that we just implicitly assume it applies in everything, but it would never be mentioned in a sentencing judgment from a judge. And they might pay a lip service from time to time, but as an actual sentencing consideration, it doesn't really go in. I could keep going.
It sounds like there's this big gap. It's like there's this big gap between like the law as it's written and the law as it's enacted, and justice is being lost somewhere in that process. Yeah,
you could say that, and it probably where it hits, because often when things get a lot of like actions that would contribute or lead to someone getting some sort of conviction, it can often be dealt with through good policing. So particularly in the jurisdiction I work with youths, a young person, the procedure of normally dealing with a young person is you firstly, if they're particularly young, they're always going to get a written warning normally. It depends what the offence is, obviously. And then they might go and complete a diversion program, if it's a bit more serious or if they do keep offending. And then after that, you'd start having to get involved in the court system. The issue with policing is that often they skip warnings, they skip diversion, they just bring them straight to court. And then the court is forced to be giving these Indigenous people records, often when they're young, but it can go through their entire life. So they're going to be stacking up histories which could have been dealt with in a much more efficient way if the police had been onto it from the start. And a lot of it is really minor crime, like a lot of breach of bail offence for bringing outside after your curfew, or breaching a loitering notice, being around town when you were told you weren't meant to be there, and it's not actual offending and not stuff that's really prejudicial to a community in any way. But it means that people have these extensive histories which could be either severely mitigated or not even exist at all if they were dealt with efficiently from the start.
So that sounds like both deeply unfair in terms of the structures that exist that enable Indigenous people to face a court system much earlier than other people in other states or in other situations. I've heard the statistic that 100% of young people in prison in the Northern Territory are Aboriginal. What is the what are the conditions that create that, and what are the specific challenges faced by young Aboriginal people in relation to police custody?
Yeah, and I can confirm that. I get sent the stats, and that's very true. There's the Alice Springs Youth Detention Centre and then Dondale Youth Detention Centre. The thing with the whole, as an overview of what's going on in the territories, treating of young people, there was a Royal Commission into the treatment of young people in youth detention centres following, when was it, 2016, those are the leaked videos of what was waterboarding essentially with a young guy called Dylan Voller. And that led to a massive inquiry from the government. And then in end of 2018, they published their findings. I'm not very well versed in the Royal Commission, but I've got an academic friend who says they reckon that they've applied less than 10% of what the Royal Commission recommended. And what was applied was ultimately just followed in Dondale, because that's the place that gets all the media hype up in Darwin. But here in Alice Springs, it's just very overlooked. It's the youth detention centre is a place that is very difficult for anyone to get into. I mean, we get to go and chat to our clients and stuff from time to time, but there's very little oversight of what actually goes on there, and it's not a very pleasant place at all. With very little focus on rehabilitative programs, it's essentially just school or isolation are your options. There is sometimes footy and other things that can go on, but it's very, very unpleasant. And the big issue with it is that for a kid to get to a point where they're being incarcerated, they normally have to have gone through a few steps in sentencing. So like I was saying before, that you normally start with like diversion, and then when you get to court, again, depending on the crime, you'd normally have a chance at a no further trouble order, which is, promise that you'll be staying out of trouble for 6 months or something, then a good behaviour order, which is an order that if you do get in trouble, you have to come back and get resentenced on this offending. And then after that, you're starting to get to the point where you're getting sentences, but they're normally suspended initially, because the general principle in sentencing is that you want detention as a means of last resort. And that's both in the Police Administration Act, in the Youth Justice Act that the court complies to. So that's what that's what the big emphasis in the Youth Justice Court is, that you're trying to keep detention as a means of last resort, try and keep youths with their families. And so for a youth to get to run through that entire gauntlet of all those sentencing options and then get to detention normally implies that there's something fundamentally wrong, fundamentally flawed in how they're being raised or how they're being treated. Or what I found the most common cause, the most common factor contributing to all those kids in custody is there's just so much cognitive impairment. The most common one probably being FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And it's something that's only being investigated really in the last 10 years. And there's a lot of research going into it, but just how that affects a young person's higher functioning. So some of the youths there are quite intelligent and they might even get good school results, but they have this impulsiveness, which has never been treated. And so that will show itself when they're, with their peers in a place of temptation to, steal something or commit another sort of crime. And that will lead to them suddenly getting these huge histories and then going to a place that isn't trauma informed, isn't assisting them cope with or learning to live with their disabilities, often not put on the NDIS, which they should be when they're very young because the schools aren't treating them with it. And then they're at a place that will just exacerbate it at the youth detention centre, as well as institutionalise them and set them up for, in Alice Springs, moving literally next door to the adult prison. So it's a really sad cycle there that normally at the point that they've reached the detention centre, you can normally see that there's a whole lot of things that are contributing to it. I probably didn't touch on a lot. Often there's a traumatic background contributing to that. And that is often paid lip service, at least in court, that territory families are the body here that assist youths, they're legal guardians if they are under a care and protection order. And sometimes they'll write reports describing traumatic backgrounds, parental abandonment or parental alcohol abuse or experience of domestic violence, being raped, being brought up. And that's acknowledged often in court, but often not given a great deal of weight in sentencing or promoting some sort of rehabilitative program in sentence. I think I've gone very off track from what your original question was. No,
that's totally fine. I think the way that you're framing a lot of these things as a social medical issue is really interesting, because I hear that and I think here is a population of peoples who have been systematically oppressed for hundreds of years through colonization, left broken, and very, I guess there's survival, there's a kind of strength of character and integrity, but also undeniably the effects of those occurrences has left us with a broken system with a lot of different problems. And then it connects to something that you mentioned before, which is helping Indigenous people navigate a foreign legal system. It is not their own legal system. Can you speak to the ways in which this foreign legal system maybe creates the friction and how it might, what you might hope to see looking forward in terms of Indigenous legal systems?
Yeah, well, there's something that we have at my work. We have client liaison officers who are Indigenous themselves and normally have very good links with community. And part of my job is going out to communities when COVID isn't locking them down. And we have bush court where it's normally at a building next to the police station, and you have one of the local court judges from Alice Springs go out and essentially conduct a normal court every 2 or 3 months. And one of the comments that one of our CSOs said, she was like, talking about a particular community, saying that Indigenous people have just learned to live with it. They know that they've learned to live that court is a part of their life now. It's never really treated as an exclusive part of, if someone is wronged, it's not that they don't really look to the white person court as being, this is our solution, because there's still what's known here as payback, which is if someone's been wronged, then that person's family, for example, if there was a murder in town, which there was 3 days ago, then there's rumours of payback. So if all the family members of the murderer have to go into hiding, because if they're seen in the street by a family member of the victim, they're going to essentially, they're described as being hit. It can be a beating. It can even get to the point of creating a further victim of homicide.
Retaliatory murder.
Yeah. So it's tough because that's not obviously something that can really be promoted. There is an advantage to having things heard out and discussed, but you still need perhaps it's been recommended in the past to have always have an Indigenous elder present in court, which does happen a bit in some of the communities to allow and show that there's some solidarity between them and the magistrate from the local court. But then there's obviously a lot of friction because they disagree often on how the sentencing should go about, because perhaps one way that a way that it could be integrated better is that, particularly with young people, for example, is keep allowing them to stay in communities, because one of that's obviously what leads to a lot of offending is a young person being torn away from their community with all their family and their home and everything there, and sometimes it's being taken to some sort of rehabilitative program in Alice Springs or even youth detention centre if it's gotten out of hand. And that often just creates a cycle of them meeting similar offenders, meeting people who will be institutionalising them essentially. So if there could be some sort of process where elders are involved in creating sentencing plans which allow youth to stay on country. There's a good example that I've seen of that in Yuendamu. There's a program called Mount Theo's, which is run by the elders there, and they'll take away teenagers, teenage boys, and teach them their story, teach them their culture, teach them their customs, and also teach them a lot of other life skills at this place called Mount Theo, which is a couple of 100 kilometres away from there. And we do everything we can to try and get our client, as soon as they start offending when they're younger, try and get them there, because that will connect them to their country. It also give them some pro-social activities to get involved in, and allow them that close connection with elders that will normally be keeping them out of trouble. But that sort of thing, it's not universal across all the communities. It would be great if it was, though, because you see a lot of benefit from it. So for that to be a consideration in sentencing would be fantastic. Just allowing essentially a diversion program created within the community instead of created by police.
I think the picture that you're painting is one where reducing recidivism and just like general incarceration rates is going to be achieved by connecting these young people to services and to culture, to country, placing them in their communities and local contexts. We've heard worldwide, I guess, like the outcry of the Black Lives Matter movement in response to the murder of George Floyd in the United States of America. But that has been something that I think has given a lot of energy and scrutiny onto Australia's shameful history and present of systematically oppressing and killing Indigenous peoples, Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Island people. And so I guess the question that I have is, in those discussions, we've seen discussions about police brutality, about dismantling or abolishing the police, as well as even maybe more radically, abolishing prison structures. And the arguments towards that are usually that the police and prison structures actually uphold an unfair status quo and abuse power, and sit at an intersection of a lot of different oppressive structures. Do you have any position on what the likelihood or the feasibility of abolishing police or police structures would be, and what kind of radical new structures we would see in their place in a place like Northern Territory?
The short answer is no. There's no way that I just can't foresee a way in which the government, any elected government, would ever abolish police or abolish the prison system, just because the Alice Springs community is so entrenched in their ways. You just see it. I guess Alice Springs is similar to a lot of other places in that you get a big divide in the way people speak about Indigenous issues, but it's probably a lot more pronounced because you have people who would, are describing themselves as explicit victims. So they're being like, no, we need to just lock up all these people that are posing a risk to me. But then on the flip side, you have all these people that move to Alice Springs because they can see that there's something that they can assist with and they want to help. I don't think that there's a way that we could, I think probably an emphasis on, instead of like the police, the whole prison system's flawed for a lot of reasons. And the more that I work in criminal law, the more you can see that. It doesn't work in reducing crime. It doesn't work in rehabilitating people. I think, and this is probably something that comes through a bit, this is my own opinion exclusively, through looking at...
Not representing Naja.
No, and that's everything that I've said today is my own opinion. But looking at the Old Testament structure of how they dealt with sort of petty crimes, I think there's a lot to learn from that. They never recommended a prison system. It's always someone's injured, they repay it primarily financially. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. There's not enough... in terms of sentencing, there's very rarely any options on community work programs. There is in theory, and they sometimes do come through, but that should be the status quo, in my opinion. Giving people the opportunity to work to pay back the individual that's been wronged, or to pay back whatever wrong that they've experienced through a loss of a use of a limb or something like that. And I think that would be more aligned as well to I can't speak for all of them, but for plenty of the Indigenous communities and the way that they would operate their payback system. It often does come down to like an eye for an eye type theory, the way that they see it. And I think that can be substituted as well for financial compensation. But I don't see that ever being legislated by a government, to be honest. We're too far down the road being entrenched with policing and extended rates of incarceration. Yeah.
So to get philosophical or maybe theological about it, you're saying that this notion of payback, which is embedded in Aboriginal cultures, mirrors perhaps some of the Old Testament thinking that we see in biblically.
Yeah.
And it's instead of having this prison institution where you just like lock people up when they've been naughty or bad, and then you don't actually have any rehabilitation, you're saying take a community-driven approach, one that looks at the cost of an action and recognize that someone has to pay the cost in order for forgiveness and healing to occur.
Yeah.
Is that a fair story of like the proposition?
Yeah, and what a lot of Indigenous people probably left feeling is if they experience the Indigenous payback, then they also have to go through the white person court. They're feeling they're having to pay double. So a way to amalgamate those would be fantastic.
I'm interested in asking you about your experiences in churches as well. You said that you were involved in youth groups here in Melbourne before you went over to Alice Springs. Are you now involved in churches in the Northern Territory? And what is the difference, if so?
Yeah, so I go to the Baptist church here, and an interesting legacy, I guess, of the missions here is that the different denominations often divided by language groups. So the Baptists have a long association with the Warlpiri people, who are essentially northwest of Alice Springs, because when the missions were first coming out here, there were just wasn't enough resources for one church group to cover it all, so they all split it up. So, for example, if you go west towards Hermansburg, it's the Lutherans. If you go southeast, it's Catholics at Santa Teresa, and it's all split up like that. So at my church, there'd be a lot of Warlpiri people there in the morning. We'd be singing songs in Warlpiri sometimes, do Bible readings in Warlpiri. But there's also there's also sometimes a Madjura language readings and a few other things. So that's so good to see, just that that unity that people have in their faith in Jesus, which it's rare to see that, I think, in other places in society. But then I've been to a couple of communities as well, and faith plays quite a big role there. So there's some, even just speaking to Indigenous people, they've got a very interesting relation with Christianity and with religion, because a lot of the strong characters in an Indigenous family is the person who was raised in a mission. So I know that there's a lot can be said about troubles that came from the missions and people being torn away from their families. But just in my experience, every day at court, if you have a youth that needs a responsible adult, it's so common for that responsible adult, for everyone in the family to be pointing to the grandmother who was raised at the mission station. She calls herself a Christian. She goes to church. She's the strong member that everyone looks to and is the rock in that family. And I've seen that too many times for that just to be like a one-off. It's quite well known that that's the strong, and it's even discussed in legal circles. We say, if you're looking for a good witness to cross-examine, or someone that has authority in court, it's always that strong Indigenous older lady. And I think that's part of the legacy of those missions. There is a lot of good that was brought, and there's a lot of faith that's there. There's some of the people here would talk about the tension between two ways. So you say some Indigenous people will at one point will be completely sold out. I'm following Jesus. I'm trying to live a good life, and it's really interesting the way it's phrased. It's often if I don't smoke, I don't drink, I don't swear, I don't do this stuff, this makes me a Christian. But then
it's very like actions based.
Yeah. And whereas I think perhaps in the Western church it's very much like grace based, or relationship based on Jesus. Whereas here it's just, they'll talk about the person that they know who's an actual Christian, their family member, and they'll be like, oh yeah, she doesn't drink, she doesn't smoke, and that's the markers of a believer for them. And they hold that person in high esteem, and it's something that they want to aspire to, but they're often just feel like they're being held back by their own. I can't give up the drink. That's something that I've heard quite a lot. Like I want to follow Jesus, but I can't give up the drink. And it's really interesting just how practical and how real down to earth that is. I think my favorite example of it is a prayer. Over summer, I went on a mission, like a week long or 2 week long mission to a place called Warburton, just over the border in Western Australia, where we ran a holiday program for the kids there. And we went to visit the church there, and it was run by these two beautiful old people there. And one of them, that was their first meeting back after everyone had gone for the new year. And they were all just sharing their testimonies and praying. And this old lady was talking about, I was at this place for New Year's Eve and everyone was just drinking and getting drunk. And they was getting out of hand and they were starting to fight. And then I was just sitting in a room by myself and I was just praying. I was just praying that all the wine that they were drinking would just start tasting funny. And then she said, and then the next day, the people came and talked to me and they said, oh, we stopped drinking last night because the wine started tasting funny. It's just a real practical prayer of her like applying it in the real world. It's just a very different way. It's a very different sort of prayer and a very sort of different approach to knowing God, I think, than the theoretical way that I think I was raised understanding God. It's just very practical, down to earth, asking God for physical protection and physical help. And it's very different.
That's really fascinating, and I'd love to ask more. We are kind of coming to the end of our time together. Oh, that sounds much more ominous than I intended in this conversation. I'd love to close with the question of, so there are people like myself that are concerned about the injustice happening in the Northern Territory around prison systems, around the legal system. How can we best support Aboriginal people and people undergoing that injustice?
I think befriending Indigenous people helps a lot. That's what struck me a lot, just coming from being raised in Melbourne, where everything is quite theoretical and you can't put a face to the statistics. Actually knowing people going through it is quite different. And actually hearing what they're concerned about, like just the biggest concern that I would honestly hear from Indigenous people isn't so much about incarceration rates and all that. It's about being torn away from country, because they value being on their land, on their country so highly, which is something that I don't think is known. But it's not often the emphasis point in the way that advocacy is done in the southern states. But I think get to know Indigenous people, ask them what their issues are, how we can assist them, and assist in that self-determination, and not have like a white savior mentality about it, which I probably have been guilty of myself as well. And probably in addition to that is that instead of looking as the government to be our savior, like we live in a society where it's often we think, this government will introduce this policy and that will solve all the issues. I think we've swung to and from and tried different, welfare systems or Northern Territory interventions and stuff to realise that it's not from government that this help is going to come. It will require self-determination, as well as if there's anything that people who aren't Indigenous can offer, it's essentially pulling aside, sitting alongside Indigenous people, mentoring, helping, assisting how they can. Because there's plenty of opportunities to be doing that. Even if you wanted to move up here, there's plenty of options to be doing that. Because that's often where the assistance is needed, particularly with young people lacking strong mentor figures, if they've been pulled out from their community, not at home, or have a troubled background, that's often having that strong figure in their life. Does that answer your question a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for chatting with me about all these different issues. It's been really great to hear from you, Sam. Thank you.
Thanks, Harry.
And take care in Alice Springs.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for watching, everyone. This is The Distillery, a series of online interviews. You can check out previous episodes on our website, distillery.site, as well as check out our future guests. And you can follow us on Instagram at distillery.site and Twitter at distillery.site. We do have new episodes. I keep saying we, it's me. But also all of these incredible guests. New episodes every day, so do check back. Take care, everyone.